You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
It's November 24, 1989, and today's the day Brenden Abbott and Aaron Reynolds have been waiting for. Abbott, a convicted bank robber, has been locked up for several months now, and he's keen to escape the confines of WA's notorious Fremantle prison. The pair have meticulously and secretly crafted fake guard uniforms in the jail's tailor workshop to their sizings, but they're apprehensive to put their long thought-out plan into place. After cutting through the bars of the workshop to access the guard's walkway, they climb up onto the roof and make their escape. Reynolds doesn't last long. He's picked up by police within a few weeks, but Abbott, he knows what he's doing. He would go on to become the most wanted criminal in Australia, on the run for more than 6 years, escaping not once, but twice from life behind bars. Known to police and the media as the Postcard Bandit, Abbott became infamous for his criminal genius, a description that has, for the past 27 years, condemned him to a life mostly spent in solitary confinement. I'm Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's episode is about Australia's most notorious bank robber, Brenden Abbott. I have two guests joining me to discuss his life and crimes. Journalist and author Derek Pedley, who's written 2 books about Abbott and was a script consultant on a movie loosely based on his life, and also Chris Nyst, one of Australia's most sought-after criminal lawyers, who represented Brenden from 1995 into the early 2000s. Derek, let's start with Brendan's childhood. What do we know about it? He was a ward of the state, wasn't he?
Brenden Abbott was a ward of the state. That happened when he was about 16, but I think probably you need to go back to his early childhood where he was the middle of 5 children brought up in Broadmeadows, the notoriously tough Melbourne suburb. His dad, no one ever quite knew what he did, but certainly all the bills were paid and the house was paid for. Brendan's family up and moved to Alice Springs in 1971 without explanation. Brendan's dad, Brian, packed up the car one day and away they went. And within a couple of years, the family fell apart. Brendan's parents, Brian and Thelma, had a very tempestuous relationship and they had 5 kids. And that ended up falling apart, and that had different effects on each of the siblings. Brendan's mum ended up in Mount Isa, and she formed a relationship with a man there, and he got a job in Tom Price in Western Australia up in the mines. So Thelma and her 5 children moved over there with him, and it was there that Brenden had his first brush with the law. I think he was about 12 years old, and there was a schoolyard tiff in which he has hit a girl with a bike pump. Exactly how serious that was, I can't be sure, but certainly Brenden Abbott maintains to this day that it was simply one of those schoolyard things. He didn't badly injure the girl or anything. She didn't require medical treatment. But as a result of that incident, he was charged with assault and he was made a ward of the state and sent several hundred kilometres south to a boys' home in Perth. And that, I suppose, was the first step on the path to his road to becoming Australia's most notorious bank robber.
Because he had a pretty bad experience at that boys' home, didn't he? He was badly treated?
He was. And Brenden Abbott's quite a stoic man. He served 25 years and he's done it hard. He's done most of it in maximum security, and he's not one to cry foul. He won't often complain about his situation. But in his early years, there were a number of situations where he came off second best very badly, and that helped shape his attitude towards the law, towards authority in general, for the rest of his life.
So it's safe to say by 1987 and that prison stint, which we're going to talk about in a sec, it's safe to say that by then he was well and truly known by police. He'd kind of been in and out of instances with the law by then.
He'd been to Fremantle Prison already. He had been involved in a snatch and grab of takings from a famous Perth restaurant called Miss Maud's, and that little crime went very badly, and he ended up doing his first stint, 18 months in Fremantle Prison, which was closed only several years later, and it was a barbaric place, Fremantle Prison. You would not send young men there these days. If you do a tour of the place, you'll see just how bad the conditions were. It was a sauna in summer, sort of, north of 45 degrees in those cells, and it was a freezer in winter, and they had 15-litre paint buckets that they would shit into, and they got very little exercise, and it was not a place to send young men if you wanted them to shape their futures well. So Brenden had already done a stint in there, and when he came out, he literally gave the place the finger as he left, and he was sure he'd seen the last of it, but he did return to his criminal ways, and in fact decided on a plan to raise enough money that he could go straight, which I suppose is the stereotypical sort of thing that criminals do, the one last big job sort of thing. He was already good at robbing electrical stores and that kind of thing, but he wanted to take a step up and rob a bank. So he put a plan into place to rob the Belmont branch of the Commonwealth Bank in Perth.
Tell me about that plan. How did it unfold?
Brenden and two of his mates did a lot of observation and surveillance on the bank, and an accomplice waited in the bank ceiling overnight for the staff to arrive. And this was one of the first sort of known instances of the drop-in modus operandi, where bank bandits would come through the ceiling and surprise bank staff. And there was a period there of a couple of decades where bank staff across Australia just lived in mortal terror because of this. They didn't know when this was going to happen again. It happened a lot, and a lot of the times it was Brenden Abbott. So they've come through the ceiling. Abbott's accomplices almost immediately let an accidental shot off, and it really was not a very professional job. An alarm went off in an adjacent business that was unrelated, but they panicked, but they got into the Treasury and they made their escape. But, and this would become a theme of Brenden Abbott's criminal career, his accomplices couldn't particularly be relied upon, and he very quickly came to the realisation he needed to get out of town fast. So he hightailed it up the coast of Western Australia, and when he got to Port Hedland, he found out that the detectives were on his trail. So he jumped on a flight back to Perth, but they were already a step ahead of him, and he was brought to ground on the tarmac of Perth Airport.
So he was caught and charged. What was he sentenced to for that crime, Chris?
Well, I didn't act for him at that time, but he was originally sentenced to 12 years imprisonment for the armed robbery. It was alleged that he had robbed the bank of about $11,000. He was sentenced to 12 years, so I suppose that's better than a year per $1,000. At that stage, he was aged about 25.
He ended up earning a few more years on that sentence, though, didn't he? What were they for?
Whilst he was in prison, he became involved in a riot, or swept up in a riot at least, and he was charged with assault in the course of that and was given an extra 4 years. But because of the nature of the laws in WA at the time, that was tacked on the top, and so all of his remissions and early release went out the window. And so he was now essentially a 26 or 27-year-old facing 16 years. And I think that sort of had, a fair bearing on what his actions he took whilst he was in Fremantle Prison.
Yeah, so in 1989, Brenden does escape from Fremantle Prison. How did he do that, Derek?
His first step towards that was getting a job in the tailor shop, where they made uniforms for prisoners, but they also made uniforms for the guards. And so he secretly knocked up a few uniforms that are very similar to what the Metropolitan Security Unit, the prison's fast response unit, wore, because obviously the guards in the towers were armed and they would not hesitate to shoot an escaping prisoner. But someone who looks like they might actually be a prison guard, there might be some hesitation. So he was working in one of the workshops, and over a period of weeks, possibly months, he's chiselled away at a bar that's allowed he and his two accomplices to pull the bar back and sneak out one day. They jumped onto a roof and made a leap across. His third accomplice didn't make the jump. He's fallen in between two buildings, broken his leg, and that was the end of his escape. But Brenden Abbott and Aaron Reynolds, his accomplice, a small-time petty thief, English guy, made it to the edge of the limestone walls of Fremantle Prison, jumped clear and jumped on the next passing MTT bus, and it was a good 30 minutes before prison staff realised they were gone, and that was it. They were away. Brenden Abbott had just begun 5.5 years as Australia's most wanted man.
I feel like we hear about prison escapes, every now and then, but they are incredibly rare, especially from, like those higher security places. So I have no doubt that Brenden would have been making headlines at that stage.
Look, I'm sure it was big news in Perth. I probably heard about it. And, we all hear about escapes from time to time. They don't happen every day. And, keep in mind those escapes include not only the tough old jails like Fremantle or Bogger Road or Long Bay or something, but also the lower security prisons, etc. Almost invariably, those people either walk back to the prison or are rearrested within a couple of weeks. And what really made Abbott an extraordinary case was the fact that he was on the run for so long, and it got up a lot of people's noses because he was on the run for so long.
Can I ask why people do end up just walking back to the prison? Is it because they get on the run and then realise it's a bit hard?
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of people in prison. Some people are institutionalised, for example. They really, that's all they know. It is, I imagine, very hard to survive on the outside, on the run. I know that Brenden Abbott has said as much to me. That is to say, it's very hard to survive on the outside, having escaped without committing crime. There's no social security available to escapees. It's hard to maintain employment because people can't have any detail. They can't really know who you are, etc. So you've got to be pretty light on your feet. So that's all pretty difficult. But also, I think a lot of escapes are done as a sort of an emotional reaction to something. People in prison suffer all sorts of concerns, obviously, and from time to time it just wells up and bang, it manifests itself and they just have to do something. And having done something, and maybe it's just as simple as getting out and going and seeing your wife or your kids or whatever, then reality bites. So I think there are all those sort of circumstances that apply.
I think when I think about being on the run for 6 years, like you just touched on, it's the realities of that. Like, where do you sleep? Where do you eat? How do you get your food? How do you not get caught? Like, did he share what day-to-day life was like or how he actually did that?
I have some limited knowledge of that just from our many, many conversations. And it's just sort of ad hoc information that I've received. But I gather that he worked when he could. And I don't know whether you remember the old television show, The Fugitive, but it was about a guy who was on the run, a fugitive. They made a film about it later with Harrison Ford. But in that television show, each episode was he'd arrive at some little town, he'd get a job working, doing sort of manual labour, and then he'd move on to the next episode, etc. But in speaking to Brenden, that was the sense that I got, that he was moving around Australia a lot. He was making a lot of different associates, as in people that he mixed with. He spent a lot of time, it seems, with Japanese tourists, just travelling around with them. There were a lot of Japanese tourists around in those days in Australia. But he'd also go to towns, small towns, he'd get jobs. They would only last a limited time. They would often have to be cash jobs. He didn't have the same access to bank accounts, and he wasn't welcome in the banks, from what I understand. So, for all those reasons, I think it was a very itinerant sort of existence.
And Derek, you've done a lot of research on this, interviewing many of the people closest to the case. What were you able to find out about Brenden's movements after his escape?
He goes on the run with Aaron Reynolds. Aaron Reynolds is not the world's greatest accomplice to have. He's not the sharpest tool in the shed, but nevertheless helps Abbott over the next few weeks avoid detection in Perth. There is a wild chase through the streets of Perth in which Abbott is at the wheel and Reynolds is leaning out the passenger side with a shotgun, firing shots at police. They slipped through their fingers on that occasion, and eventually they fled the state, and they joined a package that went to Adelaide and then up north to the NT. And on this holiday tour, which when you think about it is the perfect cover if you're a couple of fugitives, if you're hanging out with a tour group, no one's going to think twice about you, especially if you're wearing an akubra and sunglasses everywhere. So it was actually quite an ingenious method of avoiding detection, I think. They befriended a young Japanese tourist by the name of Masao Ayuda, and he had no idea who these guys really were. But they got along like a house on fire, and they took a lot of pictures together. They went on aerial tours in the NT. They went to the crocodile farms. They did all of the touristy things up there, and they took lots of pictures. And in fact, one of the most famous pictures they took was before they left Western Australia. They visited the Dwelling Up police station in the southwest, and there's the infamous picture of Aaron Reynolds with a big grin on his face with a hat and sunglasses standing right outside this admittedly very small, I think maybe one or two police officer police station, and Abbott's taken a photo. So it was a bit of bravado, but I don't know that they were in imminent danger of being captured. But the key thing here is that Aaron Reynolds eventually, after this package tour, made his way back to Perth, big mistake, and he has very quickly been arrested by police, and they have found in his car 2 rolls of film, and on those rolls of film are all the pictures that were taken on this trip that they've been on. And they've also been robbing banks in this time too, in Adelaide, to fund their lifestyle. And Brenden Abbott's getting quite good at it by now. He's starting to perfect his modus operandi. So once they get those pictures, the Perth Armed Robbery Squad decide to release them, and they make the suggestion that Brenden Abbott may have been intending to send those pictures to show what a great time he was having on the run. Subsequently, I think it was the magazine Australasian Post, you might remember, from the 1980s. They ran a story on Brenden Abbott, and I think that was actually the first time he was referred to as the Postcard Bandit.
So it was kind of the police that gave him this infamous nickname. Why would they do that?
They were getting very frustrated with the fact that they couldn't catch Abbott. And by the time he'd been out sort of 3 or 4 years, they were getting a bit desperate. And so the story was put out that he was sending postcards to the police, taunting them about the fact that he'd stolen all this money and was on the run. Now, that wasn't true at all, but it was put out as a sort of a story because the police believed that that would excite the interest of the public, who would then start to realise, well, this is a dangerous man who's on the run and taunting the police. And hopefully they would start to get leads coming in, because they were desperate, thinking, well, how can somebody be on the run for all this time and we don't get anything from the public? You know, the public give us so much information all the time. People must be hiding me or whatever. Anyway, it kind of backfired in a perverse way, because for some reason that legend or that myth about him sending postcards to the police sort of struck a chord at some level with some people, and he was seen as kind of a bit of a latter-day hero as a result.
So Brenden no longer has Reynolds helping him. He's earning notoriety as Australia's most wanted man. What does he do next?
Brenden Abbott just melts into the ether. There's no more reports of him being sighted. He doesn't really pop up anywhere. But a lot of bank robberies start happening in Adelaide, out in the suburbs, involving the modus operandi of dropping from the ceiling either into the main banking chamber before the Treasury when they open for the day, or directly into the ATM room when it's being refilled. Abbott spends days, weeks, months surveilling banks, getting to know the staff, getting to know their names. He learns about disguises. He learns about doing professional makeup. He learns how to speak Japanese. He'd already taken a Japanese course in Fremantle Prison. He buys computers. He starts making fake IDs for himself. He creates an entirely new persona for himself that's entirely covert, and eventually he sets himself up on the Gold Coast and then starts travelling back to Adelaide to commit robberies, because one of his very sort of firm rules is he only visits places where he robs banks. He doesn't base himself in the same place. He tries to keep his base well away from where he's committing his crimes. So he sets himself up really well, and eventually police realise they have a really serious problem here. Someone is robbing banks in Adelaide, and then he breaks his rule and he starts robbing banks on the Gold Coast, and he starts using the same modus operandi. Fortunately for him, the states that are looking for him are not sharing information. The detectives involved don't feel any great need to compare notes or intelligence with their interstate colleagues. So I don't know if Abbott was ever aware of this, but he was certainly aware that there were separate investigations going on.
So if police aren't sharing information, How is Brenden finally captured?
Around about 1994, his covert life is all set up and he's not attracting any headlines. And as far as the public is aware, Brenden Abbott's just vanished. He's nowhere. I was a young police reporter at the West Australian and I was looking through the library files late one night and I've come across some stories about Abbott. I've tried to find a resolution. Is there a story where he was captured? No, there's nothing. This guy has just vanished. So I contact the Perth Armed Robbery Squad, and where by coincidence Detective Sergeant Glenn Potter has just taken over the file and he's decided he's going to do something about catching this guy. And he thinks the best way to do that is to start talking to his colleagues interstate. So he doesn't tell me this, but he agrees to do a story on Abbott. And I write a major feature article for the West Australian newspaper, just as Glenn Potter is mounting this, what was called Probe Flanders. So he contacts Detective Sergeant Sid Thomas in Adelaide, and he also starts speaking to Detective Senior Constable Glenn Pritchard on the Gold Coast and a couple of other Armed Robbery Squad detectives up there. And they actually start to compare some notes on how they're going to catch Brenden Abbott. The first thing they establish is that Brenden Abbott's brother Glenn is nowhere to be found. It's probably a fair assumption to make that he's off doing bad things with his brother. So they managed to find Glenn Abbott, and they set up a covert operation whereby the police are going to put a tracking device on his car, and then they're going to find out where Glenn is heading off to. So it seems like a pretty simple operation. They're going to do a pretend traffic stop and then seize his vehicle because he's driving without a licence, put the device on there, hand it back to him, and then hopefully he will lead them to his brother. Unfortunately, Glenn Abbott, like so many of Brenden Abbott's accomplices, not the sharpest tool in the shed. He had live ammunition kicking around in the back of his ute. He had a silencer for a pistol in there, and the police had no choice but to arrest him as soon as they found that. As soon as he realised he was being arrested, he has resisted. He has pepper sprayed the two officers and then tried to grab one of the officers' guns and shoot him. And very fortunately, they've managed to subdue him and get him into an interview room. But it was a close run thing. He very, very nearly killed a policeman.
So is it the brother that gives him up in the end?
It's then in the interview room that Glenn reveals the post office box in Broadbeach on the Gold Coast where he has been sending letters to Brenden. So that post office box then immediately has plainclothes officers sitting off it. Brenden Abbott eventually comes to the post box to collect his mail. It's where he gets his phone bills delivered as well as mail from his brother. Abbott returns to the nice apartment that he's living at on the Gold Coast with his girlfriend Georgia. And that's when police set up surveillance on him. And when he leaves the apartment again, an undercover National Crime Authority officer brings him to ground on the street. And Abbott claimed his name was Barry Fowler. I've got identification on me. He did not immediately surrender and admit to who he was, but once he saw how much the cops had on him, he surrendered. He certainly didn't confess. That was another one of his rules. He never plead guilty and never talk in an interview room.
I do need to ask more about this girlfriend, Georgia, because how do you maintain a relationship when you're on the run for so long? Or did she know? Was she in on it?
I imagine that Georgia was in on it. Georgia was a masseuse, and I'll put quotes around that Brenden met, I think, in Cairns. Brenden paid for her to get a bit of cosmetic work done on her chest and other places. And there was always a woman in Brendan's life. While he was on the run the first time around, he had a long-term relationship with a woman named Louise Laycock, and they had a son together named James.
I think you just expect when someone's on the run that they're going to be, holed up in a house, not seeing anyone, not talking to anyone. It's just fascinating that he just had this normal life, so to speak, of having relationships and hanging out with his brother and, living almost a very normal out there life in the community, but on the run.
I think he was actually able to assume these identities in that he took them on. He was almost arrested in an Adelaide brothel, but he kept his cool. He was pulled over for speeding on multiple occasions. He would present his Barry Fowler driver's licence. He would remain calm and affable. He never gave a hint of who he was. Look, there was actually a suspicion that he had a relationship with a South Australian policewoman. That may have been the source of a SAPOL police radio that he was able to get his hands on. He was able to use that radio to do vehicle checks. If he thought he was being followed, he would get onto the inquiry channel on the SAPOL radio and run a vehicle check. And on one occasion, in fact, did discover that he had an undercover police car on his tail and was able to lose them. So he manipulated people, he manipulated men, he manipulated women. Detectives and criminals alike say that Brenden Abbott's the kind of bloke that you'd want to have a beer with. Now, I've never met him, but I did. There were several years there where I was speaking to him extensively on the phone when I was researching his biography. And he's an easy, affable person to speak to. There is a charm about him. And then he's gone on, as a result of this, to earn this sort of Houdini-like, Svengali-like persona. There's this great paranoia around him that he can escape from any situation and that he will befriend people and use them.
I've seen it reported around that Brenden is considered highly intelligent, especially with the way he was able to evade police for so long, even so far as to be called a genius. Would you agree with that description?
Look, no, I don't think he was Albert Einstein or anything like that. But, when we talk about genius, I mean, genius applies to a lot of things. A guy can be a genius on the football field and a complete dope on the sidelines. You can be a genius in conversation but not very good at something else. But there's no doubt Brenden is an intelligent person. He was always thinking about, what's the next move and how do I deal with this issue? Now, that was in the context of my dealing with him in legal problems, etc. But I think from the conversations I've had with him that was something that he applied to life generally. And, I've heard police speak publicly about him questioning them about, how did you catch up with me and all that sort of thing. And the police would say it in the way that he was some sort of Svengali trying to get into their minds, etc. But I think that was overblown. I think that whole idea about criminal mastermind and what a genius and all the rest of it, I think was again done by the police, and of course the press lapped it up with gusto. But I think it was overplayed. I think it was unfair, and I think it was intentionally done to try to paint him in a bad light.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Bath. I'm speaking with journalist Derek Pedley and criminal lawyer Chris Nyst about Brenden Abbott, Australia's Postcard Bandit. Once he's in custody in Queensland, there's a bit of push and pull between all of the authorities from the different states that want him for the different crimes he's committed around the country, isn't there?
The police immediately started fighting over custody of him. The WA police wanted him back. They wanted him to serve out his time over there. Queensland wanted him because he'd done so many robberies on the Gold Coast. And South Australia wanted him because, they had the most extensive list. I think there was 15 robberies, suspected robberies, between 1989 and 1995. And in fact, Detective Sergeant Sid Thomas eventually did sit down with Abbott and have a talk to him at one stage at length. And while he wouldn't admit to anything, he looked at that list and he pointed at one robbery and said, "That's not me," which leaves open the possibility maybe the other dozen or so were him. Who knows? But there were certainly a lot of banks in South Australia that were robbed.
So we actually don't know how many robberies he did do.
No, we don't. The ballpark figure that I put together from the list that I gleaned from detectives across the country was 30 robberies and $5 million,
Oof.
the biggest of which was the Pacific Fair robbery on the Gold Coast in 1994, which was probably, I put quote marks around it, his best robbery in that he got the most money and it went off so smoothly. I think it was Christmas Eve or December 23. It was just before Christmas. The bank was fully stocked with money and he got out of there with more than $750,000.
Were the robberies ever violent?
Look, any robbery is violent. And, this has been something that's been talked about over the years about, Abbott was not a violent person. And that's true in one sense. But he himself would concede that he carried a firearm into a lot of these things, not necessarily loaded and never used in any way. But, the presence of a firearm is violent in the sense of being threatening to people. Some of the witnesses spoke well of him in the sense that he was polite and not physically threatening other than the presence of, guns and so forth. And that, of course, is threatening enough.
But he didn't hurt anyone, like he didn't actually pull the trigger.
Didn't hurt anyone, no. No, he didn't pull the trigger, nor was there any sense of rough handling or anything else. His crimes were all fairly clinical, and it wasn't really the violence aspect, I think, that he was ultimately punished and heavily punished for. It was the repetition of the behaviour. It was the financial aspect of the behaviour, and unfortunately it is a true fact that financial factors seem to weigh heavily on the minds of the courts still, and certainly that was the case here. He was a threat to a society in the sense that he was breaking all the rules.
Has he ever shown any remorse for his crimes?
He has expressed regret over the years and has shown some insight to the fact that although he didn't have much remorse, I don't think, for taking money from the banks, I think he learnt remorse for the people that were there when he did it, because, you know, the bank tellers and the ladies working in the bank, they went through a level of trauma, and he has, you know, expressed to me his regret about that. But I suspect that's something that was learned as a more mature person. You know, I think as a 25, 26-year-old running around being Bonnie and Clyde, I think it probably didn't even occur to him.
Did he plead guilty when he was caught?
He did ultimately, but he pleaded guilty to much less than what he was charged with. I think he'd been lumbered with a lot of robberies that they couldn't solve that had a similar modus operandi to his. And at one stage, the prosecution were trying to run them all together so that they could prove one by virtue of the others. And that kind of fell apart to some extent because there was very, very little evidence in respect of some. And eventually deals were done and he pleaded guilty to a number of them. But, you know, there was a significant number that were discontinued.
So once he was recaptured and convicted on those charges, how much time was he looking at?
He was sentenced, I think, to 23 years at that time in Queensland.
And what did you and he think of that as a result?
This is a kind of a long, involved story, but let me just try to paint the picture. Abbott was recaptured in 1995. Now, in 1995, there were some strange things happening in Queensland. The National Party government was in government, but it was just there by the skin of its teeth. And so when Abbott was arrested, I should say, in Queensland, the Queensland Police and the Queensland Corrective Services Authorities and Queensland Government generally were running around beating their chests saying, look, we got Abbott, and, you know, he's been on the run for 6 years, we've got him, we're going to lock him up, and, you know, we're so much better than everybody else, because they were looking into future elections, etc. They were struggling a little bit politically. When Abbott went into jail in 95, the Queensland government weren't taking any chances at all. And so what they did was they essentially put him straight into solitary confinement. Now, you can't have permanent solitary confinement, or you couldn't in Queensland at that time, for very, very good reasons. But what they did is they put him into a regime which was a kind of a safety and welfare regime where they could declare that somebody needed to be put into solitary confinement for the safety and welfare of the prison. But that had to be only a 6-month limit. You couldn't put a person, that was the maximum.
That's still a long time to be in solitary, 6 months.
It's a long, long time. Abbott went into solitary confinement for 6 months and then they just backed them back to back. So the next 2 years, essentially, he was in solitary confinement permanently. And that meant being on his own in a cell about 3 metres square, surveilled 24 hours a day, his room searched on a regular basis. He was moved around from room to room and so forth. It was awful to go there and to see, you know, I've been to the prison there waiting to get in to see Abbott, and I'm standing there next to the warder's desk and they've got the television screens of him sort of lying around in his cell and they're just watching this man in this cell 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that went on for years. And that was only the start of it, but it went on until his eventual escape. But all I'm saying to you is that there was a level of hysteria at that time because everybody was trying to demonstrate how tough they were on law and order. And they didn't want to take any chance that this high-profile prison escapee could escape again.
Even in those 2 years of the back-to-backs, did you notice his psyche change?
Yeah, look, this is probably where I gained some respect for him in terms of that resilience, because he was a guy that was being exposed to awful conditions, and yet he always maintained his humanity, and he was always, for me, relatively easy to deal with. They offered him drugs at that time to sort of zonk himself out, and he wouldn't take them. He was just determined to deal with his circumstances and did. And as I said, I could admire that. There's a lot of things to condemn Brenden Abbott about in terms of lawlessness, but he does have some qualities that need to be commended.
Well, we've alluded to it, but Brenden does escape again. How? If he's been in solitary confinement all this time, how does he do a second bust out?
He had behaved well and he had been moved into the mainstream population. He befriended a young man named Brendan Bereshon and recruited him to orchestrate an incredibly audacious escape, actually, from Sir David Longland. And when young Brendan has been released, he's gone off and bought a second-hand car and got guns from some various sources, and then he's rung Brenden Abbott in prison and told him in code that it's going to be that night. And Abbott and 4 accomplices have used stuff that's known as angel wire. It's diamond-encrusted wire that can cut through steel, and honestly sounds like something out of a Bond movie, but apparently it exists. And they used it to cut through a bar on their cell block, and they escaped on, I think it was Melbourne Cup Day, 1997. So it was Abbott, 3 murderers and a rapist, and young Bereshon's run up to the perimeter and thrown a gun and bolt cutters across to them, and they've used that to break through the 3 outer fences at Sir David Longland, and there's very dramatic footage of that occurring. You see all of the prisoners duck as the armoured police vehicle approaches and starts firing at them. Brendan Bereshon returns fire and disables the vehicle. The 5 of them get through the fences, jump in the car, and create the biggest manhunt Australia, I think, had seen in probably the latter half of the 20th century.
Chris, do you remember as Brendan's lawyer when you found out he had escaped again? How did you feel?
Look, I'd been through the 2 years. I wasn't in the cell, but as the lawyer, you watch it, and I thought it was wrong what was happening. I really did think it was wrong. We'd actually been to the Supreme Court to complain about that treatment, and one of the grounds was that it was just cruel and inhumane. So, we'd been through some struggles on all of that, and I'd also become involved with the prison's legal service, working on issues of solitary confinement generally for other people, and that was pro bono work. But because of the way they were increasingly using these safety orders to essentially lock people up in solitary confinement, solitary confinement was always meant as a short-term behavioural correction technique. It was never intended to be a permanent punishment of some kind.
But when you've got someone like Abbott who has escaped from prison twice, what's the alternative? Do you put him in a stricter cell, or how do you confine someone like that who is very good at escaping?
Well, the alternative is to do what you do with all the other prisoners, is to guard them, make sure they don't escape. And, people will try to escape. You would expect that there's a potential for everybody in prison to want to escape. And so you just have to have your systems right. But, the general principle is you go to prison as punishment. You don't go to prison to be punished. So if that's what you're doing, then you do it right. And you can do that by locking somebody in a black hole and turn the lights off and let them wither away. But that might be very effective in not having any escapes, but it's not an appropriate procedure.
Well, Brenden, for the second time, was on the run for only 6 months before they caught up with him again. How did they get him so quickly this time around?
He and Brendan Bereshon set themselves up in a little cottage in Melbourne, and he resumes the covert life that he'd been living before. He had a false identity. He'd done some robberies on the Gold Coast, so he had a little bit of money. And they build this life and completely disappear. But unfortunately, Brenden Bereshon has a terrible habit that he's returned to, which is heroin. And he goes out looking for heroin one day and encounters two police officers just as he's about to make a purchase. He panics, he pulls out a pistol, shoots both of them, runs away. Very fortunately for him, both of those officers survived their wounds, but that sparked a massive manhunt. Bereshon flees back to the cottage in Carlton, and he and Abbott very quickly pack up and hit the road. They come to Adelaide and eventually head north to the Northern Territory. Abbott's got a storage shed in Alice Springs that he stops at and picks up supplies that was still there from the last time around. Scanners, laptop, cash. They head north from there, and it's in Darwin that police believe that Bereshon is there, but in fact it's Abbott who's ended up in Darwin, and they find Abbott doing his laundry in the Darwin laundromat, and when he leaves there, they bring him to ground and take him back to the police station. He actually signs a wanted poster for them and says, you could have at least let me finish my laundry. So even in those sort of moments, always the cockiness, but he was back in the same situation again with several states fighting over him, and yet at the same time not really wanting him back because he was obviously such a massive security risk and going to cost a lot of money to contain. So Queensland won that battle, and he actually got flown back to Brisbane on a government jet. And I can tell you that was the last taste of luxury that Brenden Abbott had.
When he was recaptured and put back in prison, was it straight back into solitary confinement and the same issues you were having before?
Yeah, it was kind of worse because what happened was when he escaped, the Labor Party, knowing that there was an election coming up, taunted the Nationals for, Abbott has escaped, and they had "Where's Brenden" car stickers and that sort of stuff. And so it became a political issue about the lack of security in Queensland prisons, etc. The then Corrective Services Minister Russell Cooper responded by essentially saying, we're going to get tough and we're going to get tough on Abbott. And when we get Abbott, we're going to lock him away forever. And so it became a political issue, a political football, if you like, in the lead up to the 1998 state election. So when Abbott was arrested, it was heralded as, right, we're locking Abbott away, we're throwing away the keys, he's going to be there forever. And essentially that's what they did. They put him in solitary confinement for about the next 15 or 16 years. There were court cases and arguments and so forth to try and get him out, and at times he was got out for short periods. But essentially, this guy was just held in solitary confinement. They threw away the key. It was awful. 15
years in solitary.
Yeah. And they'd move him from cell to cell, which you got to understand the significance of that. If you're in a 3x3 cell, it's your home. If every 5 days your home gets moved, you've got to pick up all of your possessions, scant as they may be in a prison situation, and you go to another cell. On a regular basis, his cell would be simply opened. The warders and officers there would take everything he owned and put it out into the corridor and search everything, turn everything upside down, etc., and then back in. So it was a very, very unsettling, difficult situation, but it went on for years and years and years.
Well, it's a wonder how you would survive something like that.
It is. And again, I guess I go back to the emotional resilience of Abbott, which I came to respect somewhat. Whenever I'd go and see him in Woodford, we'd go into a separate area. It was all sort of for him, basically, a separate area in the sense that he couldn't have any contact with any other prisoners. And he'd have a packet of Tim Tam biscuits and some cups of tea, and we'd sort of almost have this little tea party because he didn't have anybody else to talk to or socialise with. And so I'd go there and I might spend an hour there with him talking, and, we'd had legal issues to talk about, but also it was for him, I think, some social interaction, which was pretty pathetic.
He's still in prison to this day. His sentence expires in 2033, by which point he'll be 78. Is he still in solitary now, or what's his situation at the moment?
He's still there. He's finished his sentence in Queensland, and he's gone back to Western Australia. He's still stuck in maximum security. His earliest possible release date is 2026, but they won't move him to a lower classification so he can start mingling with semi-normal people again, because he still has a warrant in existence for his arrest in South Australia for a robbery that was committed in 1993, and he's tried repeatedly to return to Adelaide to face that charge. And in fact, on several occasions, one state has agreed for the transfer to go ahead, but the other one involved has then declined, because there's been 3 states involved in sort of battling over custody of Abbott across the years. So because of the continued existence of that warrant, he has to stay in maximum security, because, of course, it technically gives him an excuse to want to escape because he has to go to another jurisdiction. But they'll never execute that warrant. There'll be no witnesses around ever to testify to that robbery, and as a result, he'll keep doing a lot more time, I would suggest.
I'd love to just get your closing thoughts, because solitary confinement, like you were saying, we think it's only for a short period of time. And I guess with Brenden as an example, we've kind of learnt throughout this interview that it's being used, or it was being used, as a permanent solution. What are your thoughts on what we do moving forward, or what we should be doing as a country to treat criminals who might be that higher risk of escaping or being dangerous or whatever it might be?
Yeah. Whether rightly or wrongly, we decide that certain people should be locked away. If we decide that, then as a civilised society, we should be able to provide a system where they are locked away and they are secure, but they are given an opportunity to continue living, but B, perhaps prepare themselves for the outside world, because eventually everybody's going to go out into the outside world. And this is one of the problems that they had with the Supermax system in the US, because they locked all these guys away in solitary confinement for years and years and years. And when they were released, they were just releasing a bunch of animals from the zoo. These were not people that had been able to have any kind of social interaction or understand life at all. And a version of that happened for Abbott, because he was in solitary confinement so long that when he ultimately came to apply for parole in Queensland, the parole board didn't know what to do with him, because he could talk about the history, what got him there. He could talk about what his future, but he couldn't talk about anything he'd done in prison to rehabilitate or to readjust himself to outside life, because he had had no opportunity to do that. And, you know, there were applications for parole made to the Queensland Parole Board in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. They refused every one. Finally, we took the matter to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal said, well, no, you can't just keep this person permanently here. You've got to make some decision about it. So the decision they did was finally to say, okay, we'll allow him to be sent back to WA. Now, the last time that he applied for parole, the Queensland Parole Board sat on the case for 389 days before they gave an answer. We ultimately went to the Supreme Court about that. The Supreme Court said, listen, you've got to make a decision, and ordered costs against the parole board. And it was only when they had to pay all these costs, they decided, oh, look, the easiest thing is to get rid of him. Let's send him back to WA. And so he's gone back to WA. I suspect, I'm concerned, I should say, that in WA the same sort of issues might apply, but more so because WA, they were the ones that had him in custody when he first escaped. And I think there's a level of embarrassment there as well.
Thank you to Chris and Derek for helping us to tell this story. If you wanted to read more about Brenden Abbott, Derek's book, Australian Outlaw, is linked in our show notes. And if you love reading crime fiction, Chris has just released a book called Millen, which is inspired by a real-life case he worked on in the outback in the 80s. There's a link for that in our show notes too. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Gemma Bath. The executive producer is Moylan. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you could leave us a review while you're here in your favourite podcast app. It helps us make it into podcast charts and playlists that help other crime fans find our show. Thank you to everyone who has reviewed us already, and a big thanks to anyone listening who has become a Mamamia subscriber. Subscribers get access to every podcast, exclusive videos, and all the great articles on Mamamia. For more information, head to our show notes.